Howdy and welcome. I'm Mr. Duran, and we're going to continue our work in Game Maker Studio for completing our first game. What we're going to be focusing on today is working on creating a new enemy sprite, creating an enemy object, and working on collisions with our projectile and the enemy, and the player. So let's go ahead and jump into this. Starting off, let's go over to the sprites. Right-click on the sprite folder in the asset browser, create new sprite. From this view, again, this is the sprite editor. I want to create a sprite for my enemy. So I'm not going to get too creative with this. Again, I'm not an artist, so I'm just going to drop down a circle, maybe a smaller red circle inside of here, and maybe through other black circles, and this will represent the front of the enemy. Nothing fancy here. Make sure to rename this to represent our sprite for our enemy. SPR_enemy, Control S saves it. This works. Let's now find the center of our image. Middle center is a little bit off. I'm going to move this down a bit and over. It's not perfectly centered, but again, this is just going to be a quick thing. You'll put far more effort into this than I am, and ideally we'll have a better image. Now that we have the enemy sprite, let's go ahead and create an enemy object. Right-click on the objects folder in the asset browser, create new object. From this view, make sure you select the sprite for the enemy like we have just created. Now that we have selected the sprite for our enemy object, let's make sure we rename the object to be obj_enemy. Save, and we're going to want to create two events. Of course, we're going to start off with the create event. This will initialize the values for our enemy. Initializes values for enemy. Inside here, I want to add my health or HP. This is going to be set equal to 5. This will represent the hit points for the enemy. I also want to specify the speed. I'm going to call SPD because speed is actually a keyword within GameMaker. We just want to represent this for something else. And so I'm going to do this as 3.5. I don't want to go too fast. Again, this will ultimately be pixels per step or per frame. Next, I'm going to, we're done with this part at the moment. We've now specified the hit points and the movement speed that we will want. Spelled pixels wrong. There we go. Now we're good to go. Let's go ahead and have a new event. This event is going to be our step event. Every frame, every step, I want to specify what the enemy behavior is. If an instance exists of the player object, obj_player, that has given us, our enemies, a purpose now. If the player exists on the screen, our enemies will now chase the player. So move towards point. The specific point we want to move towards is the player object's X value, the player object's Y value, and we want to be moving at the speed of SPD. And so we specify we're going to move our object towards the player object's X value and the player object's Y value. And do note this player object dot X and player object player dot Y. Now, if we see that, we're going to run towards it. Then let's go ahead and have a little bit more. Let's see, did I spell this wrong? Instance, I spelled it wrong with an S. There we go. Now it's working. Always check these little warnings just in case it tells you something's been spelled wrong. And so we now chase the player. Let's make sure it looks towards the player. Image underscore angle is equal to the direction, faces player. And so now we've got it to chase the player, we've got it to look at the player. Let's also add in a little bit of information. This will be useful once we actually have it respond to getting hit. So HP is less than or equal to 0. When its hit points are less than or equal to 0, I'm going to want this to do something. In our case, I want to delete the enemy. The way we do that is instance destroy. This will destroy itself when we have fallen below 0 health, to 0 or below 0 health. So just so we can test what this looks like before anything else happens, let's go ahead and go back to our room, double left click on our room 1, and I'm going to drag in a couple of enemy objects. You see they're not that big. I'm going to go ahead and save this, and let's run this room to see what we currently have. We should be able to see, assuming I've typed everything correctly, the little objects will turn towards the player. As you see, the little 2 black eyes are at the front and they're following the player. I can shoot at them, but nothing's really happening right now because we haven't written that code. And they can run into me and they kind of freak out once they've made contact. So let's go ahead and try to work out how to get more interaction out of this. This is where we're going to be introduced to collisions. Let's go to our projectile object. I want to add a collision event with the enemy. I can go over to add event, and there's collisions. This is a special type of event where we can specify if we collide with a specific thing. So if our projectile collides with the enemy, do something. And so in this case, I want to do damage enemy. So here we specify that we're going to reduce the health of the enemy, but we need to specifically, let me zoom in so you can read. We need to specifically make sure they know what we're doing. I want to reduce the HP by 1, so I'm going to do minus equals 1 as a shortcut. But this is going to, by default, assume we're talking about the object projectile, not the enemy. What we can do to specify to use the enemy that we've just run into, we can say with open parentheses other. This specifies we're referencing any particular variables that belong to the other object that we've hit, in our case, the enemy. So we're reducing our enemy that we have hit, their health by 1. Then outside of here, outside of the with other, I want to, of course, destroy our projectile. Now that it's hit the target, it should be gone. This deletes projectile, and this reduces enemies' health by 1. Now we've got a little bit of response. Let's go ahead and test out what happens when we've had this code implemented. Again, in our projectile object, we have a collision event. So now I should be able to shoot at them and see they're slowly vanishing now that I've done a little bit of damage. You can mess around with how much damage you want them to do. Right now, I'm just having each of my bullets only deal 1 damage. So damage done to enemy per hit. You can increase this to whatever you think is necessary. Maybe you do 10 damage, you want to do 1 hit kills, whatever you want to play around with. But that's what this value is. If you want your enemy to have more health, if we go to the OBJ enemy, we simply in our create event specify that it gets more health. And again, this is a step event as it moves towards us. Once it hits 0, it dies. But let's add a little bit of stakes to the game. If the enemy reaches the player, we should lose the game. We're not going to have any health right now. let's go over to the player object. Let's add a collision event with an enemy. When the player runs into the enemy, we need to have something happen. In our case, I want to have the game restart. And so run into enemy. So to model that, we simply have the game underscore restart semicolon. Now, as soon as the enemy collides into us, it's game over. We've lost. Oh well. So let's run it again and see what goes on. So we can shoot them, they vanish, but if one of them hits me, the game restarts. But notice it's kind of hitting me at the very edge and I'm losing already. That's not how this is supposed to work. I want him to actually reach the space of my model. The way we can address this deals with collision masking. We need to actually go not to the object, but our sprite. I want to go to the player sprite. Over on the left side, there's the collision mask. So that means if anything comes into contact with these outer edges, it'll mark it as having collided with us and result in us possibly losing. Let's go ahead and modify the collision mask. Let's switch this to manual, and I'm going to zoom in a bit. I'm going to reduce it so only if it collides in this center space do we actually count as us losing. So this kind of gives us a little bit more leeway, but generally in game design, you always want to give the player a lot more forgiveness than you would making it harder. It depends on your game design, but generally the players are happier whenever it clearly hits them, as opposed to earlier them getting mad rage quitting because it very obviously did not touch them and yet they still lost. So this sets the collision mask for our player. Let's go check the collision mask of our projectile. I actually only want the collision mask to be the front of the projectile. And let's update that. And then let's go to the enemy. Collision mask. Yeah, I don't want to be touched by this corner of the enemy and it marked me as losing. So I'm going to go ahead and set this to manual again and do the inner red side as well. Maybe not. I'll just do the inside of it. Don't want it to be too easy. That looks a little bit more reasonable. Now that we have updated the collision masks, we can run back over here, play the game. And so now for them to hit us, you see they clearly have to run into us. You saw the collision occur. And then the shooting, I don't think the shooting is really going to be modified too much. But there is some change with how the collision mask works for both the projectile and the enemy. But this covers the addressing of creating our enemy, getting it to chase the player, addressing collisions of the projectile with the enemy and the enemy with the player, and then last, the collision masks and how to get it better set up for our game. If you have any questions or need any assistance, just make sure to ask me in class. Otherwise, that's all I've got. Thank you.